I left the family business because they didn't value me, and now they're begging for my help. I've always had a complicated relationship with my family. Growing up, our lives revolved around the chain of stores my grandfather built from nothing. Back then, the business was thriving. People respected my grandfather's hard work, and it seemed like our family was set for generations. But when he passed, the cracks started showing. My father, Richard, and my uncle, Frank, took over. They had big shoes to fill, but their priorities weren't exactly aligned with running a successful business. Richard was more interested in flashy ideas than real strategy. He'd blow money on unnecessary renovations and impulsive marketing campaigns. Meanwhile, Frank treated the stores like his personal ATM, taking out money for vacations and expensive hobbies without a second thought. It didn't take long for the cracks to grow into full-on fissures. By the time I was old enough to understand what was happening, the business was struggling. Everyone acted like they didn't notice. From as early as I can remember, I was dragged into the family business. Summer breaks? Weekends? Forget about it. While other kids played or hung out, I was stacking shelves, cleaning backrooms, or manning the register. I wasn't even paid most of the time. My parents framed it as family duty. But duty didn't apply to everyone. My cousin Alex, Frank's son, got away with doing absolutely nothing. He was the golden boy, the one everyone adored despite his laziness. While I worked double shifts, Alex was out partying or jetting off somewhere with friends, living the life I could only dream about. When I finally got to college, I thought things would change. I studied hard, made connections, and landed a solid job right after graduation. For the first time, I felt like I was building something for myself, separate from the family mess. But even then, I couldn't escape the shadow of the business. Every holiday or family dinner turned into a guilt trip. My dad would bring up how I was abandoning the family legacy. My mom, usually quiet on these matters, would occasionally chime in with teary-eyed comments about how proud Grandpa would have been if I helped save what he built. It was exhausting. The worst part was that Alex, who now had an honorary title in the company but still did no real work, joined in the guilt-tripping. He'd smirk across the dinner table, tossing around phrases like, "Not everyone's cut out for the family business," or, "It's a shame you're wasting your potential somewhere else." I'd bite my tongue, but inside, I wanted to scream. Here I was, the one who had actually sacrificed, being painted as the villain while Alex skated through life untouched. Eventually, I started avoiding family events altogether. My job was going well, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. But then my dad called me out of the blue. He sounded desperate, which was rare for him. He asked me to come by the house to talk about something important. I was hesitant, but curiosity got the better of me. When I arrived, he laid out a proposition. He admitted the business was in serious trouble. Sales were down, staff morale was low, and the stores were losing relevance in a competitive market. He claimed they needed fresh ideas, and he wanted me to take over the marketing department. He painted a rosy picture, full creative control, no interference from Frank or Alex, and a chance to prove myself. It sounded almost too good to be true. I asked him for details, like budgets, team structure, and actual decision-making authority. He brushed off my questions, saying those things would be worked out later. Against my better judgment, I started considering it. Maybe this was my chance to finally show them what I was capable of. Maybe, just maybe, I could turn things around and finally get the recognition I'd been craving my whole life. Still, something didn't sit right. My dad was never this accommodating. Why now? But he kept pushing, insisting that this was my chance to be the hero of the family. I agreed to think about it, but as I walked out of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this offer than he was letting on. Walking into the company for my first day, I immediately knew I was in over my head. The place was a disaster. It wasn't just outdated, it felt abandoned. My marketing department turned out to be nothing more than a wobbly desk shoved into the corner of a cramped, poorly lit room that doubled as a storage closet. The tools I was expected to use were ancient, a desktop computer that took 10 minutes to boot up and an outdated software suite that hadn't been updated since who knows when. Any hope I had of a fresh start evaporated within minutes. Still, I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I started by assessing what was salvageable. It wasn't much. The company's online presence was practically non-existent, and their last marketing campaign consisted of flyers printed on cheap paper that no one bothered to distribute properly. I began brainstorming ways to modernize things. Social media, targeted ads, collaborations with local businesses, there were so many opportunities to bring the company into the 21st century. But every time I brought up these ideas, they were shot down. Richard and Frank didn't take me seriously. They would nod politely during meetings, but as soon as I left the room, I could hear their muffled laughter. Frank, in particular, seemed to enjoy mocking me. He'd call my suggestions fancy nonsense and money pits, always with a smug grin on his face. Richard wasn't much better. While he didn't openly mock me, he'd dismiss my ideas with vague excuses about budgets or priorities. It was clear they had no intention of letting me make real changes. Meanwhile, Alex continued to live in his bubble of privilege. Despite having no real responsibilities, he was drawing a generous salary as a consultant. What he was consulting on, no one seemed to know. He spent most of his time lounging in the break room or making half-hearted attempts to look busy whenever someone important walked by. It was infuriating. I was busting my back trying to salvage this sinking ship, and he was being rewarded for doing absolutely nothing. Despite the resistance, I kept pushing forward. I spent late nights researching, building proposals, and creating mock-ups to show how my ideas could work. But every time I presented something, it felt like shouting into the void. My enthusiasm was met with blank stares and patronizing comments. "We've been doing fine for decades," Frank would say. "Why fix what isn't broken?" The irony was almost too much to bear. The business was falling apart, and they refused to see it. The breaking point came when I proposed a collaboration with a local farm that specialized in organic produce. It was a win-win idea. We could stock their products in our stores, tapping into the growing demand for organic goods, and they'd promote us to their customer base. I spent weeks working on the pitch, gathering data, and even meeting with the farm's owner to discuss logistics. When I presented the plan to Richard and Frank, I was met with the usual skepticism. They barely glanced at my presentation before moving on to another topic. I thought that was the end of it, but a week later, I walked into a meeting to find Frank presenting my idea as his own. He had taken my proposal, stripped it of all the details that made it viable, and pitched it as a quick partnership to boost sales. Richard praised him for his initiative and even approved a bonus for that effort. I was furious. Not only had he stolen my work, but he had also butchered it in the process. The partnership was launched with zero preparation, and within days, it was clear it was falling apart. The farm's products were poorly displayed, and the logistics were a nightmare. Customers complained, and sales barely budged. But instead of taking responsibility, Frank blamed me for not stepping up to support the rollout. It was a gut punch. No matter how hard I worked or how good my ideas were, it felt like I was being set up to fail. Frank got his bonus, Alex continued to coast, and I was left cleaning up the mess. For the first time, I started questioning why I'd even come back. I wanted to help save the family business, but it was becoming painfully clear that I was fighting a losing battle. After months of being ignored, undermined, and outright sabotaged, I reached my limit. It wasn't one big blowout, it was a series of small, soul-crushing moments that finally broke me. Frank stealing my idea was the final straw. No matter what I did, it felt like I was walking uphill in quicksand, and every step I took only sank me deeper. One evening, after another long, fruitless day, I sat down and wrote my resignation. I left it on Richard's desk the next morning without a word. The backlash was immediate. By lunchtime, Richard had called me 3 times, and my mother, Susan, had left me a string of tearful voicemails. I ignored them, but that evening, they showed up at my apartment. Richard was furious, pacing my living room and throwing accusations at me. He called me selfish, ungrateful, and a quitter. Susan sat on the couch, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, telling me I was tearing the family apart. They painted me as the villain, the one abandoning the legacy my grandfather built. But I was done feeling guilty for their failures. I told them I couldn't work in a place where my efforts were constantly dismissed and disrespected. Richard's response was a bitter laugh. He said I'd regret walking away, that I'd be back when the real world chewed me up and spit me out. I didn't even bother responding. For the first time in my life, I felt certain I was making the right decision. Within a week, I landed a position at one of our competitors. It felt surreal. During the interview, they asked about my experience, and when I shared some of my ideas, they actually listened. More than that, they were impressed. They saw value in what I brought to the table and offered me a role that came with real authority and a salary that made my jaw drop. For the first time in years, I felt like my work mattered. The difference was night and day. At my new job, I wasn't just another cog in the machine. My ideas were taken seriously, and I had the resources to bring them to life. My colleagues were supportive, and my boss actually seemed invested in my success. It was liberating. I realized just how much weight I'd been carrying working for my family, always trying to prove myself to people who never cared enough to see my worth. But of course, my family didn't let go so easily. It started with small things, Richard asking for advice on marketing strategies or Frank calling to pick my brain about trends in the industry. At first, I played along, partly out of guilt and partly out of habit. But as the calls became more frequent, it became clear they weren't looking to reconnect, they just wanted free labor. One day, Frank asked me to come into the office on a Saturday to help with a project. When I asked if it was a paid gig, he laughed like I'd told a joke. He said, "We're family, Mark. Family helps each other." That was the moment I decided I was done. I told him I'd only help if I was compensated for my time and expertise. His tone shifted immediately. He accused me of being greedy and forgetting where I came from. Richard's reaction was even worse. When I refused to help with a new campaign unless we discussed payment, he dismissed me with a condescending smirk and a wave of his hand. He said, "You've changed, Mark. You're not the man your grandfather raised." It stung, but I stood my ground. For years, I'd bent over backward trying to live up to their impossible expectations, and it had only brought me misery. Now, I was finally prioritizing myself, and I wasn't about to apologize for it. The fallout was predictable. Richard stopped calling, and Susan's voicemails turned icy. They made it clear they thought I was betraying the family. But for the first time, their guilt trips didn't work on me. I wasn't responsible for cleaning up their mess anymore. I had a new life now, one where I was valued and respected. Letting go of the family business was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but it was also the best decision I'd ever made. When the pandemic hit, it felt like the entire world came to a standstill. For my family's business, the impact was catastrophic. Sales plummeted, supply chains broke down, and the already strained relationships with employees reached a boiling point. It wasn't long before I got the call I'd been expecting, Richard, desperate and humbled, asking for my help. He didn't come out and say it at first. He tried to frame it as a family meeting, but the subtext was clear, they were out of options. When I finally agreed to meet, it was hard to hide my shock at how far things had fallen. The stores looked neglected, the shelves half empty, and the few remaining employees seemed more like ghosts. Richard laid it all out: without drastic changes, the business wouldn't survive the year. This time, I wasn't going to let guilt or family loyalty cloud my judgment. I told them I'd consider stepping in, but only on my terms. I needed full control over operations, a fair salary that reflected my expertise, and a share in the company's ownership. Predictably, the room erupted. Frank accused me of being opportunistic, calling my terms blackmail. Alex chimed in, saying I was exploiting their desperation. Even my mother, Susan, looked hurt, asking if I'd really put a price on helping my own family. But I held firm. I reminded them of how my previous contributions had been dismissed and how they'd failed to value me when I was working for free. Now, if they wanted my help, it would be on my terms. After hours of back and forth, they reluctantly agreed. They didn't have a choice. Taking over felt like walking into a battlefield. My first move was to evaluate who was actually contributing to the business. Alex, unsurprisingly, was the first to go. His consulting position was a sham, and his presence only dragged everyone else down. When I informed him he was being let go, he reacted exactly as I expected, with indignation and denial. He stormed out, vowing that I'd regret the decision. Frank was next on the list. As financial director, he'd done nothing but siphon resources and mismanage funds. He fought tooth and nail to keep his role, but I didn't back down. I reassigned him to a less critical position where he couldn't do any more damage. The backlash from those decisions was swift. Richard was livid, calling me a dictator and accusing me of tearing the family apart. Susan's silence was deafening, her disappointment evident in every glance. But I knew this was the only way forward. If I caved to their emotions now, the business would collapse, and all of this would be for nothing. With the dead weight gone, I turned my focus to rebuilding. I started by addressing the outdated practices that had plagued the company for years. The first priority was modernizing our operations. I brought in digital tools to streamline inventory management and partnered with delivery services to reach customers stuck at home. Our website, which had been little more than a placeholder, was revamped into a fully functional online store. For the first time, customers could shop from us without leaving their homes. But every step forward was met with resistance from Richard. He clung to the old ways, insisting that what worked for your grandfather will work for us. It was infuriating. Every meeting felt like a battle, with him questioning every decision I made. At one point, he even tried to rehire Alex, claiming that family loyalty was more important than qualifications. I shut that down immediately. Despite the constant pushback, the results started speaking for themselves. Sales slowly began to recover, and customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Employees, who had been demoralized for years, started to feel hopeful again. Even the stubborn loyalists who doubted me couldn't deny the progress we were making. The turning point came when we secured a partnership with a major supplier, ensuring a steady flow of inventory at reduced costs. It was a deal that wouldn't have been possible without the modernized systems I'd implemented. Richard grudgingly acknowledged the success, but I could tell it killed him to admit I was right. For the first time in years, the business had a fighting chance. But I knew the real challenge was just beginning. I wasn't just rebuilding a company, I was reshaping a legacy that had been fractured for decades. And while I didn't expect gratitude from my family, I hoped they'd eventually understand that everything I was doing was for the good of the business, and the family, even if they couldn't see it yet. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. Within a year, the company had turned a corner. The new branding, streamlined operations, and a robust social media presence breathed life into what had been a dying business. Customers returned, drawn by the modernized experience and renewed focus on quality. Profits surged, and for the first time in decades, the business wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Despite the success, my family's attitude didn't change much. Richard was particularly vocal about his dissatisfaction. He grumbled about the loss of tradition every chance he got, claiming I'd abandoned the values my grandfather built the company on. To him, the modernization was a betrayal of everything the business stood for. Frank, on the other hand, took a different approach. Sensing that the tide had turned in my favor, he began to act as though the success was a joint effort. He conveniently forgot about his earlier resistance and started dropping comments about how the family had pulled through together. Alex, of course, was nowhere to be seen. After his dismissal, he had disappeared from the picture entirely, too proud to acknowledge the changes I'd implemented. I didn't miss him. The company was better off without his laziness dragging everyone down. But even with the company's newfound success, the tension within the family remained. No matter how much I proved myself, Richard couldn't let go of his resentment. Every meeting felt like a battle, with him nitpicking decisions or bringing up how things used to be done. It became clear that, to him, the company's revival wasn't enough. He wanted control back, even if it meant jeopardizing everything we'd accomplished. I started to realize that staying in the business long-term wasn't sustainable for me. While I was proud of what I'd achieved, the constant pushback from my family was draining. I wasn't just fighting to save the company, I was fighting against the very people who should have been my biggest supporters. It wasn't worth it. So, I made a decision. I met with an attorney to discuss selling my share of the company. It was a hard choice, but I knew it was the right one. The business was finally in a position of strength, and my share was worth more than I'd ever imagined. I drafted a clear, actionable plan for the company's future and presented it to the family alongside my decision to leave. The reaction was exactly what I'd expected. Richard accused me of abandoning the family again, this time in its moment of triumph. He said I was selfish, that I'd used the company to boost my own career before walking away. Frank, always opportunistic, tried to position himself as the logical choice to step into my role. I didn't argue with them. I simply handed over the plan and told them that the business's success, or failure, was now in their hands. The deal went through smoothly, and I walked away with a substantial payout and, more importantly, a sense of closure. For years, I'd let my family's expectations and guilt weigh me down. Walking away wasn't just about leaving the company, it was about reclaiming my life. In the months that followed, I focused on myself for the first time in years. I traveled, pursued hobbies I'd put on hold, and reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my time at the company. The weight I'd been carrying for so long was gone, replaced by a sense of freedom I hadn't felt in decades. Looking back, I'm proud of what I accomplished. Saving the family business wasn't just about proving my worth, it was about honoring my grandfather's legacy in a way that mattered. But I also learned that loyalty to family shouldn't come at the expense of your own happiness. For too long, I'd let their expectations define me. Walking away was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but it was also the most liberating. Now, when I think about the family business, I feel a strange mix of pride and detachment. It's still standing, and that's enough for me. I've moved on to a new chapter in my life, one where I'm no longer trying to live up to anyone else's expectations. For the first time, I'm writing my own story.